Good afternoon. I'm Bijan Karimi, the Assistant Deputy Director for the San Francisco's Department of Emergency Management. And on behalf of NEMA, I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA webinar, Why is Cyber Different? A practical orientation to cyber threat and incident management. There are stories almost daily about cyber incidents impacting businesses and government agencies. Here in San Francisco, we've had our own challenges. During an insider threat in 2008, a sysadmin took control of the city's wide area network, and in late 2016, somebody gained access to our public transportation's payment system, demanding 100 Bitcoin. In mid-March, the city of Atlanta was crippled for 5 days by a ransomware attack. Many emergency managers think about physical threats and hazards, and that often leads to the idea of causes and consequences. If you can identify a consequence, you can plan for it and you can mitigate it. But cyber is different. So, as emergency managers, what do you actually need to know about preventing, responding to, and recovering from a cyber event? That's what we're going to talk about today. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Christopher Godley. Chris has spent most of his career as a local government emergency manager, most recently as Director of Emergency Services for the City of San Jose. Now in the private sector, as a Director of Emergency Management for Tetra Tech, Chris currently leads cyber incident preparedness planning, training, and exercise projects across the country, including the nation's first major cyber incident response plan. In the last year, he's worked on 4 different disasters. And following last year's devastating wildfires in Northern California, he's currently serving as the interim emergency manager for Sonoma County, California. Chris, off to you.
Thanks, Bijan. I appreciate that. Thank you all very much for joining us. I think you're going to find this a very interesting discussion. And I believe you'll come away with not only with knowledge, but some references and tools that will help you jump right into this. And again, I'm coming at this from the perspective of an emergency manager, not necessarily your IT guy. So don't have them critique my technical skill set here or terminology, but I think for emergency managers, this is going to be a great session. Before we get started, there may be a few of you that actually remember Y2K way back in 1999. We were all concerned about microchips failing and causing our infrastructure to fail. Airplanes were going to fall out of the sky. It was very challenging because there was wild speculation about the potential impacts of technological failure. And as emergency managers, most of us were not in a position to really talk about the technology or really address the technical issues that people were raising. It was a significant frustration for many of us. And so if you go flash forward about 13 years, the city of San Jose had a Pacific Gas and electrical substation located just south of it. Someone decided to take a rifle and shoot up the cooling tanks and drain the cooling liquid out on the ground, which caused the transformers to overheat and fail, bringing down that portion of the electrical grid. Now, you're wondering why that's got to do with cyber, but also as part of that attack, the perpetrators first opened a manhole, went down inside, took a pair of bolt cutters, and they cut the fiber cable that was serving that station. And that was to bring down the alarms and the camera systems. But inadvertently, they also cut basically the internet, if you would, to about 230,000 people south of the city. We lost all sorts of good, exciting things that helped keep our world amazingly moving fast. And that included our phone system, our 911 system, radio systems, the ability to control water supply and distribution, points of sale for commercial structures. So literally with a $40 pair of bolt cutters, somebody took out the 21st century for about 240,000 people. As an emergency manager, I sat and I watched and I figured if it wasn't a physical attack, the next event would be a cyber one. So let's flash forward to today. We've had recent activities, many of you are aware, you're probably on this call because you've seen or heard of these things. In March, we had 7 pipeline operators confirmed communications were shut down by hacking. It didn't disrupt the actual physical flow of the gas, but it did cause significant billing delays and disrupted their business model. The city of Atlanta in March of this year, as Bijan mentioned, was subject to a sophisticated ransomware attack. Many of the city's databases and systems were compromised by basically locking up the data via encryption. The attackers wanted $51,000 worth of Bitcoin in order to provide an access password, and it took 2 and 3 weeks to resolve, and there were actually, as late as last week, a few systems that had still not been brought up online. And next image there is showing the ATI, an outdoor public warning system. Although not hacked, there were vulnerability warnings that were put out that these systems that we personally as emergency managers depend on were vulnerable to software hacking. And then finally, the Russian hacking effort that we've all heard about, targeting routers worldwide. Many of you actually saw some messages as recently as last week. If you have a home router, you're supposed to turn it off and turn it on to disrupt the malware that's been installed on that. And so these are just evidence of how close, if you would, cyber disruptions are coming to impacting our real day-to-day lives. Not just the theft of data, intellectual property, or simple criminal activity for financial gain. We're starting to see potentially significant disruptions in those systems that our communities truly depend on day to day. As we move through the agenda here, our next item is going to be just a few quick terms. We're going to introduce additional language throughout the discussion this afternoon, but very briefly, it's important to note that the world of cybersecurity can be overwhelming. The technology, concepts, hardware, and how we've integrated the internet into our daily lives is all transformed in just the last 20 years. The language especially can be very daunting. So just a few terms here that are most critical for us. First is cybersecurity. This is basically our attempt to prevent or mitigate the threat by providing for protections in our data systems, whether they're our own internal systems, if you're a government employee, or in your community, your financial, commercial, and utilities also have a significant cybersecurity investment at this point that consists of both physical and software systems that are designed to help detect and minimize the threat of these attacks from disrupting their own systems. The internet, of course, we all talk about it, but basically it is a system of systems. There is no one in control of the internet at this point. It's literally made up of disparate groups, individuals, nation states, putting together networks, and it's organic beings is the best way to think about that. But it's important to note that it's not one single system. It is really, literally millions and millions of systems put together. As we move through the terms here, another one we should call out is cyber incident. This is a term that's used both in terms of the information technology folks out there. They talk about an incident disrupting their networks, compromising their data, not allowing for full access to the data or sharing of information. We also use it now in the emergency management community to talk about the actual physical disruption of a system caused by a cyber attack. So much like we would attempt to address the needs and issues that come from a wildfire incident or a flooding incident, now so to cyber incident is going to be entering our vocabulary. SCADA, S-C-A-D-A, for supervisory control and data acquisition. These are the control systems that allow for remote access, monitoring, and actually literally managing of many of our major infrastructure systems and manufacturing processes. So, for example, we might use a SCADA system to monitor the flow of water through a potable water system, and an operator might throw a switch and a valve shuts 5 miles away that diverts water to a holding tank. These are the systems that were originally built as independent standalone systems. They were analog, if you would, hardwired directly into the control board, but now many jurisdictions have taken advantage of the efficiencies of the internet to literally put both the control system and the device being controlled on the internet. Of course, that has now opened us up to significant potential threat. We won't go into too much detail, but it's important to note that most of these SCADA systems are much older, kind of legacy systems from the 70s, even in the 80s, and it's very difficult to protect these systems if access is provided to the outside world via the internet. Another great term is IoT, Internet of Things. You may have heard this term used in popular media. It's used to describe any of these devices that are connected to the internet. It used to be your computer was smarter than you were, then it was your refrigerator connected to the internet. Now, even in my case, the washing machine, you can connect it to the internet. Of course, these devices have vulnerability. Many of these are not password protected. Security is very low. And so it's easy for someone to come in and kind of take over your thermostat or your refrigerator, which doesn't sound too challenging, except they can also be harnessed as weapons to actually use as a kind of a zombie robot army to send messages back and forth and sometimes even attack specific websites. So your refrigerator can actually be in the war right now for cybersecurity. And then ICS, Incident Command System, is the one we all know. But there is another version of this called the Industrial Control Systems. Very similar to SCADA, these industrial control systems are increasingly challenging to manage in terms of the variety and the scope of work that's going on. We're starting to see industrial control systems installed not just in manufacturing plants and major utilities like we might imagine, but literally in your car when you push a button and you want to shift from two-wheel drive to four-wheel drive. That's the industrial control system that's taking part of that for you. And so that's why it's a significant focus. The digital version of these industrial control systems, again, are significantly vulnerable. Well, an important part of the vocabulary that we're going to talk about, the fact is the Internet itself is consisting of what we call the web. The Internet is not a single system, again, multiple systems put together. And a good analogy for this is that when we work with the Internet, most of us go onto Wikipedia and we Google this and we want to check what the news is going on. We're actually what we call the surface of the web. This is really only about 10% of the entire Internet that's available out there. So while we think we're searching the Internet, we're actually only searching a very small part of that. Another key component of this is what we call the deep web. The deep web is also something that's accessible to us. This is where we store data. We might have our medical records online. We might have tax records online. This is where people will file away the data that you can search for and obtain through the surface. This constitutes about another 40 or 50% of the Internet, and it's completely data-driven. A few systems in there, and there are some specialized search tools. For example, academic search tools are designed to really go and move through this deep web much better than Google does on the surface of the web. And then finally, there's something we should discuss briefly, and that's called the dark web. The dark web is anywhere from 20 to 40% of the complete computing power of the Internet, depending on who you talk to. And the dark web is where people put data and they put websites that they don't want to be found. You cannot search the dark web using Google. There are actually specialized search tools that will drive you through the dark web and allow you to obtain information there. The dark web has got a notorious reputation at this point because this is where people are putting illegal information, stolen credit card numbers, for example, or this is where you can buy drugs, that kind of thing. But it's also important that the dark web is a significant hunting ground and resource base for those that would conduct cyber attacks. In the dark web, you can actually search for and obtain software that will allow you to attack a certain target. It allows you to, if you would, launder Bitcoin that you might have stolen from somebody. So significant activity is occurring well below what we see on the surface of the web. And the last set of terms are, we need to talk about our hackers, those individuals that we've either met or we've certainly seen in popular media. And there are three basic types of hackers. First is what we're going to call a white hat hacker. This is an ethical person, a security professional that moves through the Internet and attempts to identify security vulnerabilities. Basically, the white hat is an individual or a group or a company that has permission to come in and work inside your system, hopefully to detect and disclose vulnerabilities so you can protect yourself. Now, a black hat on the other side, these are the individuals and gangs, if you would, that may be malicious in nature. They might be just curious. They may be seeking recognition. But the defining moment is they really don't have permission to be navigating inside different systems and networks or databases. These are the individuals that conduct criminal activity that we'll talk about in just a minute. And an important last term is those that would wear the gray hat. These are the people that kind of fit in between. They claim to wear the black hat and hack without permission in order to be able to better protect clients when they are wearing their white hat. However, some wear the black hat when the white hat is simply not paying well. So when you talk about cyber security risks, players, actors, they're probably wearing one of these three hats full time. The next discussion area is actors and methods. So who are these people that are out there? Well, there's four basic groups. These are first, they have different reasons as to why they would commit any criminal hacking. The first would be personal gratification and notoriety. They want to really show to other peer people that they've got what it takes to be a hacker, if you would. A second group, and the largest group by far, is those that would conduct hacking and illegal activity for financial gain. These recent breaches, like many of the commercial major retailers that we've seen hacked over the years past, like Target and Home Depot, have been struck in order for individuals to steal and then sell that financial data on the underground internet black market, otherwise known as the dark web. It's interesting that hackers can also team up with actual criminal gangs to realize money. For example, credit card data can be sold for people to go out and start spending money on real goods. So there's a thread of criminal activity that extends from the hacker and into the actual exploitation of that information. A third group are those that would disrupt. These might be individuals that want to create anarchy or chaos, or it might be simply a student now wanting to take a final exam and make a mess of things. These are people that are just trying to express themselves, and they've decided that because of their computer skill set that hacking is a viable alternative for them. And then finally, another group of hackers with different reasons for committing criminal activity are the nation states, government-sponsored organizations. Now, this might be actually staff and the employee of a government. It might be a criminal gang that's been subcontracted by a government to perform these activities. But they are looking to either identify potential targets for future exploitation, they're looking for intellectual property, they're looking for trade secrets, edges in competition, but they also may be working as an extension of their military, where they see cyber as the new landscape for conducting aggression against one country from another. We have both kinetic attacks that are occurring. These are your traditional military model, involving armed soldiers, aircraft, those kinds of things, as well as now our cyber attacks. And this is increasingly popular, and this is why the U.S. federal government has most significantly ramped up its cyber command over the last 2 years. So those are kind of your four groups of actors. A little more detail. Activism, again, these are the individuals that might want to get in there and make a protest, is not necessarily illegal. People can express themselves. However, when they start moving into criminal hacking, that is, when they start defacing a website from a community or a government agency, for example, or even a corporation, that's a crime. People can't express themselves at the expense of others. And so the anonymous group is the most common one, and it's pictured here. It's not really a specific group or organized group of individuals. It's kind of an alignment. And so you'll find a lot of people suddenly getting excited about one topic of intense discussion one day or one conflict, and they'll just jump in. They'll call themselves part of Anonymous, but they're not necessarily paying any dues to Anonymous. Another individual that's really interesting is an actor, and this is a term in the internet and cyber community called a script kiddie. This is literally, could be a young person, absolutely could be a teenager, is the kind of the prototype for this, but it could be someone that has just enough computing skills to kind of put together bits and pieces of software, identify targets they want to go after, and then they can actually conduct hacking and cyber attacks without having a great deal of sophistication. They'll literally go on the dark web and they'll buy packages of software. And they can deliver that software even by outsourcing it on the dark web. And so these script kiddies are online either to show how good they are, or they've just decided that they want to make a dent or actually make some money, and so they've learned just enough to be dangerous. And then finally, our image of the hacker or cyber criminal is really that person in the hoodie. It's kind of become ubiquitous. It's really annoying the cyber community, by the way. But the majority of crime is now actually committed by cyber gangs. Basically, they've become the new mafia. And so 80% of cyber attacks are actually driven by these organized crime rings. And this is what happened in Atlanta earlier this year. It was a very organized crime ring that specialized in cyber attacks involving what we call ransomware. And because they're so efficient and so good, their attack was extremely effective. And we're starting to see more and more of this as gangs move away from high-risk physical criminal activity into the world of cyber activity. and the tools they can employ, their ability to outsource, if you would, for resources, whether it's staff, smart people, or money laundering, is so easy now on the dark web that it's going to see a profound growth over the next 10 years. So if these are the players, the way they actually conduct business is basically a 5-step process. They're going to reconnoiter a potential target. They're going to look around the edges. They're going to see if anyone's left any cyber or virtual doors open or windows. They're going to look for, and this is, so, for example, how Target was attacked. Target has good information security, but several years ago, someone realized that the company that runs their air conditioning for them was not so well protected, and so that's where they found their way in, just by doing a little groundwork, if you would. Once they've discovered a method for entry, they're going to exploit that method. They're going to go in and not just enter into your network or system, they're actually going to kind of prop the door open, if you would. They may create a backdoor, a secret entrance into your network that you're not even aware of. It's significantly challenging to detect people that have been able to exploit these systems. Many times they'll just go in and they'll just sit there for months without moving. And so systems activity indicators, other technical measures of how people are potentially influencing or have infiltrated your systems are not necessarily going to be successful if they're very patient. Next, they're going to move up. They're going to try to gain access to the network by identifying individuals that have powerful tools like systems administrators, that kind of thing. And they're going to start moving around inside the system, moving laterally, that kind of thing, where they're going to look to see if there are adjoining companies, divisions, other potential targets that might have valuable information or resources they could exploit. And then finally, once they've kind of done their homework, if you would, they'll initiate those activities. They'll actually take software that's been implanted in networks or systems that's been infiltrated and spread around quite a bit, and they'll simply activate that software. And it's very challenging at this point to respond to that from the IT perspective. So these are the actors, and these are the methods that how they will actually come in and exploit vulnerability in an organization and really begin to start creating havoc. If those are the general methods, the next thing is actually how do they do this? And this is much of the terminology that we've heard over the last several years as it's becoming increasingly probabilistic that all of us, even individuals, will see some form of attempted, if not successful, cyber attack in the next year. Many people feel that between 20 and 30% of individuals and jurisdictions are subject to cyber attacks over the course of a 12-month period. A few terms here. Malware. This is basically bad software. This is where we used to, and we still kind of group all the terminology you may have heard of in the past, like viruses, keyboard tracking software, anything that's not designed to provide a productive service on your system that someone is using to detect information or exploit vulnerabilities is considered to be a category of malware, including ransomware. And the ransomware is basically where someone's going to come in and either take your data from your network, or much more commonly, they're simply going to encrypt that data, keep it on your computer, but you cannot access it. They're quite literally holding your data for ransom. And this is what happened in Atlanta, and this is the most common now form of malware attack for financial gain is ransomware. It's an increasingly automated process. They don't necessarily have to identify and target you as an individual or organization. You may be simply an individual organization that was on a database that was purchased, and someone's just going to send the software to you, and we'll see what happens. Website tampering is also a significant mode of attack where individuals can come in and they can physically alter your website. They can put up their own messaging, defacing if you would, but they can also implant malware on your website so that your clients, your customers, if you're in the government, your citizens will go to your website assuming it's secure, and when they click on a link or they look at a certain image, bang, the malware gets downloaded onto their computer. We're starting to see this to be increasingly popular as a workaround for many of the cyber defenses that have been developed for emails and other systems. Spoofing, a fun term. This is where individuals can actually pretend to be someone else. It is completely possible to spoof an email address. Right now, if not me personally, but if I knew someone that could, they could actually go on and they could pretend to be any person you know, the governor of your state, your boss, and the email that would show up when you receive it would read from your boss. So it's very difficult for you to detect whether or not the email is actually coming from the person that the from line says. So this spoofing is increasingly popular because it enables other kinds of more social engineering attacks. The social engineering is basically the version of conning somebody, where an individual can make contact with another individual, whether over the phone, in person, it might be via email, and they're going to attempt to kind of con them into doing something for them, maybe giving them some passwords, maybe cutting them a check for $10,000. Social engineering is an increasingly significant threat, as many of our communities are vulnerable to this, especially our seniors, individuals that have less sophistication with either languages or the use of the computer systems. We're starting to see this become a really, truly significant effort because, again, many of these systems can be automated. You can actually buy client lists where these people have been identified as having been vulnerable in the past, either because of certain behaviors or because they were actually hacked in the past. And you can buy that list and you can try your luck, if you would. Under social engineering is a term that we've all probably seen called phishing, P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G, where we're going to go out and we're going to look to see if we can get someone to do what we want to do on an automated basis. I'll send out 10,000 emails to everybody in a state organization, and I'm hoping 2 or 3 or 4 of these people will read my email and click on the link and allow me to install my malware on their computer systems. Phishing is increasingly sophisticated. It used to be the Nigerian princes were offering you lots of money if you just help them get their money out of the country. But now we're starting to see phishing attacks that are very sophisticated in format and language. It's challenging to distinguish between real and criminal activity. Spear phishing, a subset of this, is we're actually going to go after a specific individual. This might be a financial officer in a county government. It might be someone that's in charge of human resources in a major corporation. But if we can get through and we can get those people on the line to do what we do, either cut us a check or give us access, we're going to have huge success in exploiting that throughout the rest of the organization. And the last term, distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS. This is where basically all get 500,000 computers, maybe some of those Internet of Things that we talked about earlier, and we'll all gang up and we'll all call one person's website at the same time. So if I don't like, for example, a commercial retailer, I can actually harness my army of computers, and I can tell them all to start calling that Internet site at the same time. And because the Internet site being targeted can't handle that volume of traffic, it will usually crash, or at least it won't allow regular and authorized users to access that website. This is also increasingly popular. We've seen this in the past in just the recent year, and the effects can be profound. We can shut down maritime shipping lines. They can lose $200 million, and it's all automated. It's not personal. Your name just showed up on a list. My software hunted you out, and away we go. This is a slide showing that your personal files are encrypted. This is a screen of death. This is what malware looks like, and this is specifically ransomware. This is where they give you a message saying your files are encrypted unless you give me Bitcoin by a certain time. They even put a nice little counter on the bottom of the screen. You're not going to get your files back. So it can be a real challenge. And only about 50% of the people that give them money are successful in getting a password. This is an example of a phishing email I personally received. Looks pretty good. It took me a little while to go, this isn't right. And by the way, banking industry is not going to send you emails asking you to log on and corroborate your security information. So that's great, Chris. Those are horrible things that can go wrong, the people that can do those things to me. Let's talk about what the impacts might be from my organization and my community if I'm an emergency manager. First, Impacts are not just IT related. They can shut down systems. There's impacts for public affairs. The law enforcement's got significant responsibilities here, evidence collection and investigation versus actually mitigating the threat. But we're also starting to see more significant, profound effects directly as a result of the, if you would, brittleness of our infrastructure. The efficiencies that we've adopted that allow just a few people to manage large systems like electrical transmission systems come with a little bit of an Achilles heel in terms of security. It's easy to take these things down. This slide here is actually a chart that demonstrates from the U.S. Department of Energy that they believe a cyber attack could produce longer and more significant outages in the electrical grid than those caused by hurricanes. And for those out in the southeast of the U.S. and the East Coast, do you know what that looks like? If you had to double that in terms of outage extent and duration, you can see how much of a challenge cyber presents. And this is not just because someone's thrown a switch somewhere. It's because the actual control systems that would be used to bring the electrical grid back online are compromised. And that's kind of like taking away the tools from the auto mechanic. He's going to have a hard time fixing your car. In terms of primary impacts that we talked about, we all know the critical infrastructure. Almost all of these are dependent on either enterprise, i.e. business data systems to communicate and move information back and forth, or SCADA and industrial control systems to actually manage the physical systems that they're responsible for. Any one of these can be hacked. Every single one of these has been hacked successfully with some significant disruption somewhere in this country in the last 3 years. There is also significant concern that nation states are beginning to move into these sectors more aggressively just to identify, but not necessarily immediately exploit vulnerabilities, but just to put them on the list of, here's a back door we might want to have in the future. So all of us that are responsible for critical infrastructure, whether it's prevention, mitigation, or responding to disruptions in these critical infrastructures, need to understand that cyber is present in every one of these. Now let's talk about us, the role of the emergency manager. How are we going to move into this world of cyber? If we don't have a great technical background, that's fine. Cyber is something that we're going to have to address. Similar to many of the more exotic, if you would, threats and hazards that we already do wrestle with. Many of us are responsible for integrating public health preparedness, especially for pandemic. You don't have to be a doctor, you just have to know enough to be dangerous. And so as an emergency manager, what steps can we take to kind of move into that area? So here are 5 things that we can do. The first one is get smart. Much like when Y2 came up, don't let yourself get taken for a ride. You need to read several reference materials, maybe take some cybersecurity awareness courses to get down concepts in the vocabulary. Look at the people and the resources in your organization that can help you with that. I will share with you that one of the handouts today that you can click on here is our Emergency Management Cyber Consequence Resources Review report. Basically, it's your top 40. Think of it that way, your top 40 references. And this could be reading material, it could be sample plans, but also classes that you can take online for free. And so basically, job one for emergency manager is get smart. Number 2 is look around, see what's already going on in your area, your region, and your state. There are already people that are already working in cybersecurity. Find out with your IT department risk manager, are they as paranoid as you are? Are they really beginning to address not only protecting their internal systems, but wrestling with the idea of how would we work and support the community if it was impacted? The next step we can take for emergency manager's role is to re-examine the planning scenarios and assumptions. So, for example, how much does your emergency operations center depend on the internet? And what about your communication systems? How good is your continuity of operations plan? Not necessarily the cities and the counties, but even your own specific emergency management coop. Do you have one of those that will allow you to function if you lost connectivity and the ability to use internet-based systems? We may need to update our plans and references based on real-world incidents to really take a look at, hey, if that occurred in my jurisdiction, are we prepared to address it? We do this for every other threat. We're going to have to start taking cyber less of a one-off, or it's going to be more like an asteroid in terms of probability, but it's increasingly more likely that we're going to be impacted as a community, if not specifically our own organizations. And then finally, we need to emphasize the manager in emergency management to really move into that influencing policy and resource allocations, especially when we talk to IT and communication systems. We're going to need to have some say in the fact that these are now life safety systems and that we're going to have to protect these. Okay, the players around you, much like you do for any other functional specific or hazard specific effort, you've got another group of characters, if you would, actors on the stage. And so we have to look at who we talk to when we talk about cybersecurity and cyber incident response. There are a few here that I'll highlight for you, again, in the reference materials. I certainly suggest you take a look at that. The first one is local IT, or local information technology, inside your own organization. Those people and individuals you depend upon to run your systems, and they may be outsourced, by the way, and they may be a company that's actually doing a lot of this work. What are their capabilities? What are their needs and interests? Are they plugged into cybersecurity? Are they a resource that you can go to if there's a community disruption? Or are they going to be so tasked with attempting to protect or restore their own systems that they're not going to be able to help you out at all? That's an important thing to look into. State IT, the same way. If locals get overwhelmed, many of us go to the state and ask for resources as a matter of course. So where are they at in terms of cyber? Are they ready to come and down and provide resources for you? Do they have private sector organizations and networks they can tap into to augment your own efforts? You can talk to your CERT teams. And before you get excited, that's not our community emergency response teams, the individuals trained to kind of take care of neighborhoods after a disaster. These are computer emergency response teams, CERT. These work either within local IT or regional IT networks or in the private sector. These are the folks that are going to come in and help fix, if you would, what's going on with one single system. They're going to try to restore the data and bring the whole system back online. The CERT teams in Atlanta, for example, last March were extremely active for about a month. A fusion center, many of us are aware of our intelligence coordinating centers located across the country that serve regional areas for sharing criminal and terrorist activity. Many of these now are picking up the cyber mantle, if you would, and are developing internal cyber intelligence capabilities so they can identify and cross-level cyber threat intelligence information, much like they would for gang activity. The fusion centers are also a significant portal to many of the federal resources that are available out there. The feds, of course, will broker through the Department of Homeland Security, and there are a good half dozen organizations that could come in and assist local governments depending on the nature of the event that's occurring or the sector or discipline that's being impacted, whether it's public safety or utility systems. Vendors, there's always someone there willing to sell you cybersecurity materials before the event, and there are quite a few firms that will help you deal with the cyber crisis event. In addition to actually serving as IT experts and bringing up your own internal organization's systems, they can also be a touchstone, a reference point for how do you deal with this kind of disruption on a SCADA system affecting a water network. They may have not only the technical expertise, but again, the network that allows them to reach back and find people that can help you in a major crisis. And so those are some of the stakeholders that can help you address many of the technical issues, but you've also got all the other stakeholders you normally work with, your universities, your schools, your private sector, commercial organizations, your utility systems, governmental, public safety. All those players have a cyber vulnerability or have a role to play if there's a cyber disruption event. At one point, way back in the day, we thought we could just take cybersecurity and attach it to an emergency operations plan, cross out the word earthquake, and we've got an annex. But stakeholders have different needs and interests when it comes to cyber. It's going to take time to sit down and talk with them to find out exactly what their needs and vulnerabilities are. For many, it's financial. For some, it's public safety of their clients or bases. And so I'd certainly suggest as you take a look at this to broaden that net and really identify our stakeholders across the spectrum. As we go through the agenda, as we talked about what emergency managers are doing, let's talk about planning. Absolutely. So how do our big bunch of emergency plans now deal with the cyber threat? There are a couple different challenges here that we might not see in other hazard impacts or other threats if they're impacted our community. For example, situational awareness. If there's a cyber disruption in the community, that might be no notice. We might not have any heads up that it's coming, or it might be part of a larger incident. Maybe it's something that's occurring in a specific sector or discipline regionally or even across the country. There's also some concern that individuals or organizations might exploit cyber after a jurisdiction's already been impacted by another disaster event. We've seen some cyber criminal activity after Hurricanes Irma and Harvey. Not so much in Maria, but certainly we've seen cyber activity. So we're starting to get concerned about our traditional response being compromised by cyber, but we won't know about it until it happens. So situational awareness continues to be a challenge. It can be a big event. It could be incremental in scope, small things leading up one after the other. It might also be difficult to detect. Unlike a major physical hazard or threat that's impacted a community like a hurricane, cyber doesn't necessarily show, signs of damage. There's no smoke, if you would, except for you start to see failures or disruptions in systems. The stakeholders that are dealing with cyber might not see the urgency because it's just not as exciting as dealing with a hurricane. There's not that emotional tie-in. People always say it's an IT problem, but more and more they're going to have to become involved, but they may be slow to pick up on that. And then how do we classify severity? I'll mention on the next slide one scheme for that. It's a challenge because cyber is difficult to categorize in terms of the impact on the community. This is a schema slide called the Cyber Severity Schema from the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. Basically from 0 to 5 is how they're rating impacts. And again, this is focused on a national definition of severity, but it can be and has been adapted for local governments to really kind of give people an idea that, okay, how big, how wide a problem is this? How much of a response are we going to begin to mount? Where's the dotted line that's going to trigger, if you would, that fuller response using the traditional emergency management program? I'll mention that for cyber response plans, for incident response plans, again, it's not just looking internally to your own organization. It's really addressing a community that may have been disrupted, whether it's physical infrastructure, utility systems, or banking systems. Our emergency plans are not necessarily sufficient to address those like they would any other hazard. They also make the assumption that the internet and all the cyber resources are in fact going to be there to support the response rather than being the problem. There's also going to be, not in addition to the physical disruption, the loss of systems, the loss of traffic signals, or you don't get enough water pressure at your fire hydrants. There also could be a significant social disruption here, where people, their social fabric has been torn because the schools shut down. They can't drop off their kids. And so now they have to stay home and can't go to work. We might see social disruption in that people are going to maybe potentially lose trust. If your institution's been attacked, or if your community has been attacked, what's the social response that going to be? We've not seen a significant wide-scale cyber attack in this country, so we're not quite sure what the implications are going to be on the social response to it. So you have to decide if you need a plan, where's the plan going to reside? For most jurisdictions, they're really attaching it as an annex to their emergency response plan or EOP. If you use emergency support functions, that's a good fit for cyber because it gives you the granularity that allows you to break out not only the impacts by ESF, but how each ESF can fit into cyber response. And you need to identify who's going to be in charge. Is it IT, or is it still going to be emergency management with IT built into it? And how does IT, whether it's your own organizations or external sources, how does that fit into your EOC? Is it part of operations, investigations, planning? So, number of questions there. So to do that, the suggestion at this point is to look at cyber much like you would pandemic planning. You're integrating a whole new set of multiple new stakeholders that are not necessarily operationally oriented. They've got a very different culture from many of the public safety or government organizations that you traditionally work with. It's going to result potentially in a loss or degradation of workforce, and there's huge numbers of secondary impacts that fall out from this. And so when we're developing this plan, the Annex Approach is good, the departments are good. I will share with you, Miami-Dade has done this job. Hats off to them. By the way, developing that plan took about 1,400 staff hours. So it's not a light lift for a major metro area. And then for exercising, traditionally we exercise plans. Well, if we don't have a cyber plan, that is my suggestion, is don't start with the plan. Start with the tabletop exercise. Get people to socialize the idea that they may be vulnerable to a cyber event in their community, identify champions and lead stakeholders, and then turn into the planning effort. I should mention that we've had some success moving away from traditional exercise models. In regular exercises, participants are usually organized or broken out even by geography or jurisdiction. Cyber is actually a new subject area for most responders, and so we have to educate everybody concurrently. But when we exercise, the people that work in various disciplines are the ones that need to work together. So for example, if you have multiple jurisdictions in a large regional tabletop exercise, instead of organizing by jurisdiction, you may want to organize by discipline. So you put all the IT folks in one room, cyber intelligence and investigation folks in another one, operations responders, public information in another one, and have them work the issue as a discipline rather than by jurisdiction. And so another step might be to consider an enhanced tabletop exercise where you can take these function-specific breakout groups, and as they conduct simultaneous discussions, facilitated of course, you may be able to allow for real-time messaging between the groups so that if investigations has a question about information technology, IT can respond back to them. So it's right in between the tabletop and the functional exercise models that most of us are familiar with. Another great tip is to swap hostages. You'll actually send people from one jurisdiction to the other, and what they'll do, or from one breakout group to the other, is that they will be able to share information real time, serve as subject matter experts, and relay not only content and subject matter expertise, but bring back from that group information that's going to be helpful for their discipline. So the idea of an enhanced tabletop allowing for functional discussion is an excellent move. And finally, as we get into resources, really is a fundamental question for emergency management. Again, developing that IT expertise. We don't have to become wizards. There are great numbers of wealth of information out there. We've highlighted the top 40, if you would, in the consequence resource reference review materials. I think it's going to be an excellent place for you to start. But if you have any questions, my point of contact information is on there. Many people have specific issues or concerns regarding a unique jurisdictional consideration or utility system. I'd certainly be willing to share that. I've got a few hundred here references that might be of value to you. And so that's really the discussion, information, presentation up to this point. But certainly as you have questions, please let us know. Hey, Bijan, why don't you take that?
Thank you, Chris. Several of the questions that have come in from listener DF, he's got a lot in there, but I'm kind of packaging them in this way. The Internet of Things, my refrigerator, my washer, my who knows what else is getting on the Internet. It is encapsulated in this idea of a smart city, everything talking to one another. When I'm done with milk, it's automatically ordered and ends up at my home. All that information is being changed around. Protocols. What type of protocols are in place or should be in place in an Internet of Things type environment?
Wow. So how do you defend against the future? Okay, that's an excellent question. Well, as an emergency manager, this really steps into the role of mitigation. We are going to have to understand that we're not going to have much influence on the ability to really prevent the attack using the Internet of Things. I wish I had a better answer for you. That's a really good question. protocols for that is going to be first safeguarding your own systems. When you purchase and procure systems that you're using for emergency management and public safety, or even as the overall governance and response, are you doing due diligence on those systems? Are you introducing vulnerabilities by buying a webcam but not changing the password on that webcam? And so, as many of us are familiar with our continuity of operations plans, we're now drilling down through our vendor supply chains to make sure they can in fact provide what we need during an event. We're going to have to do the same now to address the cybersecurity vulnerabilities so that we're not compromised during a major community event.
And DS, let me add this. Of the research that I've seen, we have two competing factions. We have the manufacturers who want to make things as simple as possible for someone to use their product, but at the same time, we have the overall security issue. And is this a place where government or your agency should advance some type of perhaps legislation to say, here are the minimum requirements we have? And so that's kind of that balance between ease of use and also the appropriate regulation to keep us safe. All right, moving to another question from MW. He asks, on one of the slides you identify who all the different players are. You mentioned the feds. What type of Department of Defense cyber capability may be able to assist in the 5 phases of emergency management?
Well, at this point, if we're talking about the Department of Defense, there are several resources that they're offering at this point. First, to the National Guard, there are actually cyber teams now that are designed to support and augment primarily local governments and state governments as they respond to cyber attacks affecting their own systems, their own internal systems. So the National Guard is developing a larger cyber corps. There's a more significant discussion ongoing right now with the new Cyber Command that was established earlier this year in the Department of Defense and its role in addressing state players, if they're beginning to conduct attacks inside the United States, or by extension, there's even some discussion, should we involve DOD in addressing criminal activity that's involving private sector organizations? And of course, above all of this is if there's activity involving threats to our electoral system and the voting systems. The DOD mission at this point is not fully defined in terms of mitigating or striking back, if you would, against these players and actors. But I'd certainly start with the National Guard. That's probably our best input in through Northern Command into the DOD for augmenting primarily state and local government efforts.
The next question is coming from Mississippi, and this is in regards to and linking to another one about anyone who has approached this issue from a core capabilities and broken them out across different jurisdictions, maybe the different parts. That's the planning side. We also had another question come in from SO wanting to know, have any models successfully attempted on the response side to bring in IT and emergency management in unified command? So kind of before and after.
Those are both great questions, and the answer is yes. I'll share with you, though, however, one of the challenges in attempting to gain proof of concept or people that have done this kind of work before is many of the cyber incident response plans that are being developed by local and state governments are not being shared. They're considered confidential. People are not passing them around like they would an earthquake or a hurricane plan. And so it's difficult to go out and get those. So it's going to be working through the network to identify those best practices, but I can share with you in developing for, say, Miami, we did in fact crosswalk this with core capabilities. We took a look at how Miami and its core capability set now, how would we address the cyber disruption event through that? Not cybersecurity again, but cyber disruption. And then that also included a model for response where we integrated information technology into the response effort. It was not a unified command. Because we're dealing with the effects, if you would, of cyber disruption. The primary issue is attempting to safeguard public safety, of course, and minimize property destruction and economic loss. The traditional emergency management organization was modified, however, to integrate IT as a key player, bringing in not only to the Emergency Operations Center, but the Fusion Center and the large regional information sharing network that they've established for traditional events was, if you would, flavored to bring IT into that world, because IT has a significant situational awareness component, technical expertise, of course, but in many terms, IT also needs resources to address this. Maybe they need external stakeholders, maybe they need private sector partners, and so the Emergency Management Organization was really designed to help reinforce their efforts as well.
With that, everyone, thank you so much for participating today. We've got a lot of questions that we answered, and if there are any questions we didn't answer, we'll be able to provide you responses by email. Chris, thank you for sharing your experience and expertise. Thank you again. Please enjoy the rest of the day. And if you're interested in learning more about NEMA, visit the website nemaweb.org.